Long History's random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Number 33, Arthur Balfour. The Last Wheeze. Hello everyone and welcome again to Long History, or welcome to any new listeners. This is Long History's series called Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, where we literally take a Prime Minister at random and then ask a series of questions, such as how did they get into office, what did they do in office, and why did they leave office. Along the way, we paint a picture of the times and the person involved. So if you like the sound of that, don't forget to subscribe. And there's already plenty to explore on your podcast provider and on longhistory.net, our website. So let's get going to the Prime Minister who I thought had more or less been forgotten, but who nevertheless even today raises controversy. This is Random UK Prime Minister of the Week number 33, Arthur Balfour, the Last Wheeze. Ask anyone to name the first Prime Minister of the 20th century, that's the first to begin and end his time in office in the 20th century, and few people will know the answer. You know because you're listening to this episode, but why has Arthur Balfour been all but forgotten despite being in charge in such a transformative moment in the UK's history? He doesn't even seem to be a pub quiz question. Balfour was not a political titan, yet less than 2 weeks before the time of writing this script, he was in the news when a portrait of his was daubed with paint in protest. So how could this forgotten Prime Minister be so controversial? We'll discuss that in this episode. It's curious, for example, to read about a Prime Minister whose name I actually personally had never particularly heard of, to find that some people disliked him so much. A.J.P. Taylor, for example, the famous historian, whose book British Prime Ministers we've used quite a bit in these episodes. He absolutely loathed this supposedly forgotten man. To quote, he appears a detestable man, cynical, unprincipled and frivolous. So that's quite a strong opinion about the 20th century's first Prime Minister. But I can think of one or two more recent Prime Ministers we can say that about. The biographies we've looked at to research for this episode are split and they're either neutral or negative. It's hard to find any positive comments about this man, although they are there. And it's strange to read the cooler facts in less opinionated biographical fragments. For example, we can coolly state that Balfour followed his uncle Robert Gascoigne Cecil, the Marquess of Salisbury. Now he was a Victorian titan. However, if we look at that fact less coolly, well, doesn't this mean that Balfour was actually an example of blatant nepotism? An uncle handing his reins of power to his nephew? It's something you'd expect of the 18th century, but this is the 20th century. That historian A.J.P. Taylor, in the meantime, states that Balfour led the Conservative Party to, quote, open-eyed into its greatest electoral defeat. This is the man who would let the Liberal Party into office for at least a decade, a government that would transform the country. Other Prime Ministers have been accused of all but fatally damaging their political party. Herbert Asquith and David Lloyd George pulled the Liberal Party apart, and perhaps even Ramsay MacDonald, who headed the first Labour government but didn't usher in a new age of socialism in the UK, and lost his allies and his reputation along the way. We've already created episodes on all these Prime Ministers. What was Arthur Balfour like? Well, one biography stated that his was a fin de siècle premiership, and it's a curious but telling description because the term most generally is linked to the end of the 19th century, less so to the early 20th century. Now that can be debated, but either way, this is a description of him that is clearly backwards looking. The fin de siècle term links him also to Archibald Primrose, who was Prime Minister less than 10 years earlier. Both these men seem to be somewhat entitled aristocrats who inherited their premiership from their predecessor and then lost it in the subsequent general election, when the public actually had their say. Looking at the two men together, it seems that the establishment was casting around for new blood, clawing around for the best of the next generation to replace those titans, Gladstone and the Marquess of Salisbury, but they weren't really finding much, and therefore they reached for their default setting, entitled upper-class gentlemen. And despite being much younger than their predecessors, neither of these men ushered in the new age, and both were pretty poor prime ministers actually, in very many ways. Primrose actually being a strong candidate for worst prime minister ever, and Balfour not being that far behind. It seems the times were changing and the establishment just wasn't keeping up. The electorate was only gaining in size, but the establishment didn't seem to be paying much attention to the people who were voting for them. It's a rather depressing situation that many people will be able to empathise with today. And if the Victorian era had already become the late Victorian era by the time of Archibald Primrose, Balfour somehow seemed to stretch out the Victorian era even though the Queen herself had died. The 19th century had also ended, just to underline the point, and Balfour can be seen as the last wheeze of an era which was sinking into its deathbed when the old patterns weren't working anymore. Of course, there are always many opinions, and A.J.P. Taylor in his article was actually reacting to another opinion about Balfour, which said that he was a marvellous political tactician. Taylor dismisses this claim entirely, however, but other biographies do say that he was intelligent, open to reform, and if not exactly underrated, at least underestimated. Yes, but the descriptions soon turn negative again, painting a picture which struggles to rise above the cliché of an intelligent but entitled aristocrat doing the job more or less as a favour to the British people because he didn't have anything better to do. This was once again very much an 18th century attitude to politics, but this was the 20th century, and the First World War was just over a decade away. Balfour shares one other detail with that predecessor from less than a decade earlier. Archibald Primrose had married, but the rumours were persistent that he was gay. Discussions of Balfour's love life in the meantime are noteworthy in their lack of detail. There does seem to be a consensus that Archibald Primrose was gay, but he tried his best to hide it by marrying a woman. Balfour didn't go that far, being a lifelong bachelor, but the terms used to describe Balfour and Primrose's personalities are quite strikingly similar. Balfour apparently was a mystery, a guarded and an enigmatic man. Also, he is said to have fallen in love with a woman in his youth, but she tragically died and he never loved again. These are all clichés that can lead to a homosexual conclusion, but in general these were closeted years, and so the gaps have been filled with speculation and gossip. It does make you wonder if these attempts to make him sound mysterious because he had a hidden side was hiding the fact that he really wasn't a very interesting man, really. He was apparently an excellent speaker, but he seemed to lack discipline and was only interested in what he was interested in. Another symptom of an entitled upper-class man. What was the historical background? The Victorian era ended with the death of Victoria herself in 1901, and Edward VII's coronation was actually less than a month after Balfour took office, so Balfour was the first Edwardian Prime Minister. And the Edwardian era, although it does have its own traits, can be seen as the last gasp, an Indian summer, before the First World War swept everything aside. The Second Boer War, in the meantime, ended just weeks before Balfour became Prime Minister. This is the war where the British asserted their power against the Boer population in South Africa, inventing concentration camps along the way. What was happening in the UK itself at the time? The Hound of the Baskervilles, the most famous of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, was published during Balfour's time in office, and this seems to have been a bit of a mini literary golden age, with Joseph Conrad, Henry James, Rudyard Kipling, Beatrix Potter and H.G. Wells all writing their best work at this time, and Ian Forster publishing his first book in 1905. In the 1901 UK census in the meantime, there were almost 41.5 million people in the UK, which at the time included the whole of Ireland. So what was happening over in the US at the time? Theodore Roosevelt was president of the US during Balfour's whole time in office, and Utah entered the Union in 1896, while Oklahoma entered the Union just 2 years after Balfour left office in 1907. Who could vote during those years? We like to look at this question in every episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week to look at how democracy has evolved in the UK. Arthur Balfour never won a general election, and when the 1905 general election was held, no women could vote, yet by this time most men in work who were older than 21 could vote. Women would get the right to vote in 1918, and this was all part of the century of reform, which began in 1832 and would eventually lead to women getting the vote on equal terms with men in 1928. What was Arthur Balfour's background? Befitting of the most well-connected of people, Balfour was born in 1848 in a large mansion in East Lothian, Scotland. That's the area to the east, slightly south of Edinburgh. He was the third of 8 siblings. His mother was part of the aristocratic and powerful Cecil family, with his famous uncle, that Prime Minister, the Marquis of Salisbury, being his uncle on his mother's side. His father and his grandfather in the meantime had both been MPs, and his godfather was the Duke of Wellington, another former Prime Minister, so this was a man who was well connected from birth. He was also another of the 20 men who went to Eton to become Prime Minister. He was even taught by the same people at Eton as the aforementioned Archibald Primrose. In fact, this was one period when Eton particularly seemed to dominate politics, with every Prime Minister since 1880, 4 of them, including Balfour, having gone to this famous institution. Balfour went to Cambridge University, however, rather than Oxford, unlike his 3 prime ministerial predecessors. Looking at what he was interested in, it's difficult to find any passion for politics in him. He seemed to be more interested in philosophy and actually published books about it. He enjoyed playing golf, for example, and he was a member of a group of intellectuals called the Souls. He became an MP in 1874, first for Hertford and then from 1885 for Manchester East. He worked in many roles in government, and he was definitely helped by his uncle, who'd been Prime Minister from 1885 onwards. He was the Irish Secretary, for example, and he seemed to have uncharacteristically firm opinions about Ireland. He was against Irish Home Rule, thinking the Irish should either be in or out of the United Kingdom, with no half measures. He argued, for example, that Irish calls for independence were down to economic factors and put in practice policies to help assuage the Irish by encouraging landlords to sell their land to their tenants and reduce some of the tensions. And well, such economic arguments might work in the short term, but for example, Frederick North said the same about those pesky colonists when they decided they wanted to declare the independence of the United States, and look how that went. In 1891, Balfour was given a very prominent title in politics, First Lord of the Treasury. It's an important title because it's generally given to the Prime Minister themselves. In fact, Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury nowadays are more or less synonymous terms. Balfour was in fact the last First Lord of the Treasury not to be Prime Minister, because his uncle who was in charge at the time was actually the Foreign Secretary. It's a situation that just doesn't occur anymore. How did Balfour become Prime Minister? By 1902, Balfour's uncle was in his 3rd and final stint as Prime Minister. However, by this time he was 72 and he wasn't in the best of health, and he'd been widowed in 1899. Balfour was chosen to succeed him as Prime Minister when he resigned, because he'd taken on many prime ministerial roles when his uncle had suffered from poor health in the past. It seems to have been an uncontroversial succession at the time, and it officially took place when Gascoigne Cecil, the Marquis of Salisbury, resigned in July 1902. His uncle would die just over a year later. Balfour, in the meantime, became the head of a coalition government comprising the Conservatives and the Liberal Unionists. These were a grouping who had split away from the Liberal Party because they didn't agree with Irish Home Rule. It did mean that Balfour inherited a coalition rather than one single party running the government. What were Balfour's biggest achievements as Prime Minister? For one of the all but forgotten Prime Ministers, Balfour's time in office was reasonably long at 3.5 years. The biographies, however, do seem to want to reach somewhat to find his achievements. His most notable one is the 1902 Education Act, which was a controversial reform to the education system, going some way to organise education funding throughout the country. And when money is involved, of course, you're going to upset some people. He's also said to have laid the foundations which improved relations between the English and the French in what is, even today, referred to as the Entente Cordiale. So why did Balfour stop being Prime Minister? A debate was raging in politics at that time. It's one of those debates that almost seems quaint looking back, but even now we're having not dissimilar ones regarding Brexit. This one was whether to prioritise general free trade across the world or to prioritise the empire and raise more taxes on goods from non-empire places. The Conservative and the Liberal Unionist coalition were split on this issue. Balfour tried to keep both sides of the debate happy, but as we've seen many times in random UK Prime Minister of the Week, sitting on the fence can lead to innumerable splinters. In trying to make everyone happy, he pleased no one. There were resignations, which in turn reduced Balfour's authority, and this led him to resign at the end of 1905, hoping that the leader of the opposition wouldn't be able to form a government in his place. It was a risky move, where he hoped to shore up his power, but instead the opposite happened. Campbell Bannerman, who was backed by Liberal heavyweights such as Herbert Asquith and David Lloyd George, he did manage to put together a minority government, which then went on to gain a majority in the election that soon followed, pushing out the Conservatives for a decade or more. Why should we remember Arthur Balfour? So we haven't forgotten that question at the beginning of this episode. Why was this forgotten man in the news only recently at the time of writing? Well, despite all of the above, we still haven't mentioned the one thing Balfour is most remembered for. This happened when he'd left the role of Prime Minister and took place in 1917 during the First World War, when he was Foreign Secretary and put his name to the so-called Balfour Declaration. In this declaration, the UK government published a statement saying that it supported the creation of a homeland for Jewish people to be located in the area of Palestine. And the declaration's words themselves seem quite innocuous, but this declaration would begin a chain of events that were not uncontroversial, shall we say. It was almost as if Balfour, having tried to solve the Irish issue, decided to solve another issue with a nice little memo. And perhaps we can overread meaning into such matters, but it does seem somehow representative of Balfour that he would write an innocuous document, blissfully unaware of its consequences. And of course there was another matter just around the corner, the First World War. As we said with Archibald Primrose's episode, just when we needed decisive leaders to lead us away from war, instead we got another rather entitled upper-class gentleman who actually didn't even seem to like the general public. The summary is quite stark, really. He inherited his job. He was apparently willing to allow for some reform when the country was crying out for serious restructuring. This wasn't a man up to the job that faced him. It doesn't add up to the most auspicious premiership ever, and although there have been worse prime ministers, the general public seem to agree with this assessment, at least to the extent that they turfed him and the Conservatives out of office with a landslide, letting in a reformist government that would at last begin to set the tone for the 20th century in many ways, although in doing so it would rip itself apart, all whilst World War I was looming ever closer. Thank you for listening to this episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. I think Arthur Balfour was a difficult Prime Minister to summarise. There seemed to be quite a lot happening on his watch, and although rather lugubrious, he doesn't seem to have been one of the lazier Prime Ministers, and perhaps he can't take all the blame for the fact that a new era had begun and the establishment was still working with old rules. As always, please remember that this is just a brief introduction to the man himself. There has been lots written about him, and many opinions, of course. We do try our best to be accurate, of course, but sometimes mistakes slip through, so do forgive us for those. Above all though, please see this as an introduction, so if you're interested you can carry on and do your own research. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do give it a like before you move on, and share it with any like-minded people. As always, that's much appreciated, so thanks for that. This was Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 33, Arthur Balfour, The Last Wheeze. See you in the next episode.